Abraham Lincoln, long considered one of America's greatest presidents, met his fate at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. on the night of April 14, 1865. The true motives of his assassin, an actor and Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth, have been debated since that night. But regardless of what Booth's ends may have been, his action changed history and the course of a nation. Today, we're going to examine the timeline of the hunt for John Wilkes Booth. Before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel. After that, we'd be most grateful if you would leave a comment and let us know what topics in American history you would like to hear about. Okay, so let's see how they captured one of the most infamous assassins in U.S. history. When Abraham Lincoln won re-election as president in 1864, John Wilkes Booth and his fellow conspirators formed a plan. They would kidnap Lincoln, then trade him back to the government in exchange for the release of Confederate prisoners of war. They also formed several contingency plans. One plot aimed to intercept Lincoln in March of 1865 while he was on the road, but a change in the president's schedule nixed that idea. Another included capturing Lincoln at Ford's Theater and then lowering him out of his box using ropes. However, the Civil War was winding down and a Union victory was becoming increasingly certain. The release of POWs wouldn't make a difference anymore, so Booth resolved to take a more drastic and bloody course. Killing Lincoln was only supposed to be the tip of the iceberg. Booth's full plan actually called for something like the climax of the movie Casino. He and his fellow conspirators intended to kill 4 key Union officials that night. The other targets were Vice President Andrew Johnson, Secretary of State William Seward, and Union General Ulysses S. Grant. The idea was to throw the entire Union side into chaos by taking out the leadership. This supposedly would give the Confederacy time to regroup and attack Washington. When the night came, Booth used the connections he acquired as an actor to sneak into Ford's Theater. When Lincoln was distracted watching a play called My American Cousin, Booth entered the box, pulled out a Derringer pistol, and, at 10:15 p.m., shot Lincoln in the back of the head. Booth had no way of knowing it at the time, but this assassination would be the only one of the 4 planned to actually succeed. After he fired the fatal shot, Booth rushed past the witnesses and tried to leap to the stage below. Henry Rathbone, an Army officer, attempted to stop him, but Booth stabbed Rathbone in the shoulder. Immediately after, Booth leapt to the stage, landing awkwardly, breaking his leg. The theater audience sat in confusion. Some thought the goings-on were part of the play until they heard the First Lady screaming. Booth stood up on stage and yelled 3 Latin words that would ring down through history. Sic semper tyrannis, which in English means, thus always to tyrants. For the record, he didn't write that himself. The phrase sic semper tyrannis was historically associated with Brutus and the assassins of Julius Caesar. Interestingly, Booth had once acted the part of Brutus in a play. The phrase was also the state motto of Virginia. The president was dead. The atmosphere in the theater turned to chaos. Soldiers flooded the building. Booth knew he had to flee the city as quickly as possible. A co-conspirator had arranged for a horse to be waiting for him at the stage door. Booth jumped on the steed and crossed the Navy Yard Bridge into Maryland. Booth was met on the other side by a conspirator named David HEROLD. They rode together to a town called Surrattsville, Maryland. There they went to Surratt's Tavern, whose proprietors were hiding some supplies for the men. Knowing that the army would be hot on their trail, they didn't stay long. They gathered what they needed, armed themselves heavily, and headed back on the road. At 4 a.m. on the morning of April 15th, Booth and HEROLD arrived in Maryland at the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd. Mudd set Booth's broken leg and let the 2 men rest at his home for a few hours. While Mudd was a small-town physician who was known to be sympathetic to the Confederacy, it is unclear whether he knew Booth and HEROLD or were aware of what they had done. He would later deny any knowledge of the conspiracy, but it didn't do him much good. They sent him to prison anyway. Regardless, once he was strong enough, Booth and his partner hit the road again. They got lost in a swamp and then paid a farmer to help them find Rich Hill, which was the home of another Confederate sympathizer named Samuel Cox. Slowed by Booth's leg, the 2 men wouldn't arrive until 1 a.m. the next morning. Samuel Cox may have been sympathetic to Booth and HEROLD's case, but he was also acutely aware of the danger they posed to himself. Over 1,000 Union soldiers had been mobilized to search for Booth, and a bounty placed on the conspirators had reached $100,000, roughly the modern equivalent of $1.5 million. If Cox was caught aiding and abetting the fugitives, the consequences would have been severe. Knowing this, Cox sent Booth and Herold to a nearby pine thicket at the edge of his property. That would give them the chance to watch for an opportunity to cross the Potomac into Virginia and would give Cox plausible deniability if they were caught. Booth, for his part, was furious that Cox wouldn't let them in the house. Nonetheless, they stayed in the thicket and tried to adjust. Booth and Herold stayed in the pine thicket for a total of 4 days. On occasion, a friend of Cox named Thomas Jones would bring some food, drink, and copies of the newspapers. This was how Booth first learned that he was being almost universally condemned as a villain and a coward. Having considered his act heroic, Booth was genuinely shocked. In his diary, he compared himself to historical figures like William Tell and Marcus Junius Brutus, wondering why he was being considered a common cutthroat while they were lauded as heroes. It's unknown when Booth began keeping this diary, but the document remains the only first-hand account of Booth's thoughts during this time. It is from this diary that we know on April 18th, a column of Union soldiers passed within 600 feet of the pine thicket. Concerned that their horses would give them away, Herold chose to silence the animals. While Booth and Herold continued to lay low and drink whiskey, the country was mourning a president. Back in Washington, D.C., thousands of people came out to watch the funeral procession that carried Lincoln's body to the Capitol building. A private service was held for important figures and those close to Lincoln. The following day, the rotunda was opened to the public. Citizens came in droves to say goodbye to their president. The following day, his body was loaded onto a special train that would carry it to its final resting place in Springfield, Illinois. 6 days after the assassination, the soldiers searching for Booth moved out of the area near Cox's home. Thomas Jones informed the fugitives, and at dusk on April 20th, they set out again. Though the Potomac was only 3.5 miles away, progress was likely slow due to Booth's leg. When they finally did reach the water, Jones put the 2 men in a small skiff. Refusing payment for his services, Jones put the 2 men out on the river and parted ways with them. Unfortunately for Booth and Herold, the night was foggy and navigation was difficult. Rather than land at Muchudoc Creek in Virginia as planned, they got lost and ended up in Maryland. On the 21st, the fugitives managed to get supplies from a farmhouse near the creek. They returned to the boat where, for reasons that remain unclear to this very day, they did nothing. Historians speculate Booth's leg may have been acting up or that the 2 men may have heard rumors of Union patrols in the area, but the truth is lost to history. All we know is that, rather than escaping down the Potomac as planned, the fugitives spent the night of April 21st at Nanjamoni Creek in Maryland. The fugitives headed out again the following evening. It was again foggy, but now the mist was working in their favor by helping them get down the river unseen. Booth's diary records a close call. The skiff crossed into the path of a Union gunboat, but they managed to avoid a collision and the fog kept them unseen. Meanwhile, Union forces were drawing the noose tighter around the 2 men. Back in Maryland, Dr. Mudd's house was surrounded by troops, and the proprietors of Surratt's Tavern had been arrested. The Army knew Booth was heading to Virginia and began to flood the roads there with soldiers. On the morning of April 23rd, the fugitives reached Virginia. They immediately made contact with a sympathizer named Elizabeth Queensberry, who fed them and then sent them to meet with a Dr. Richard Stewart. They successfully reached Stewart's home, but as soon as he learned who they were, Stewart kicked Booth and Herold out. In need of shelter, the men decided to head to the cabin of a free black man named William Lucas. Like Stewart, Lucas refused to let the fugitives spend the night. Angry and desperate, Booth threatened Lucas with a knife and then made him and his family spend the night on their own porch. The following day, Booth and Herold forced Lucas's son to take them to Port Charles. There, the fugitives met a former Confederate soldier named Willie Jett. Jett offered to hide the men in a house he had arranged for, but the house was being occupied by 2 unmarried women. Ooh la la. The presidential assassin and his partner felt it would be improper for them to stay there under those conditions, so they continued on. On April 24th, Booth and Herold reached a farmhouse owned by a man named Richard Garrett, whom they did not know. Booth, perhaps using his acting skills, convinced Garrett that he and Herold were soldiers and that Booth's leg had been broken in the course of his duties. Garrett fell for the ruse and gave the men a place to sleep for the night. The following day, Booth slept late, got drunk, and played with Garrett's children. By that evening, the family had grown suspicious of the fugitives and insisted they spend the night in the barn. Booth agreed and headed to his new lodging for some sleep. It would be the last night of sleep he would ever get. While Booth and Herold slept, the Union troops closed in. Willie Jett, the Confederate soldier who had tried to help them escape, had tipped off the authorities as to the fugitives' whereabouts. At approximately 2:30 a.m. on April 26th, Booth was awakened by the sound of horses approaching the barn. It was the cavalry. He woke Herold and the two tried to escape. What they didn't know is that shortly after they went to sleep, the Garretts, who were fearful the fugitives would steal their horses, had locked them into the barn. They were trapped. The Union forces surrounded the barn. They had orders from Secretary of War Edwin Stanton to take Booth alive, so a standoff ensued. Herold, for his part, begged Booth to let him surrender. Booth agreed and let Herold go, but he had other plans for himself. As the standoff dragged on, the Union soldiers began to surround the barn with kindling. Booth could tell they meant business, and that his time was running out. He tried to avoid his fate by challenging the commander of the Union forces to a duel for his freedom, but the soldiers weren't having any of that. The kindling was lit and the barn went up in flames. Booth charged out and was quickly shot by a soldier named Boston Corbett. In his final moments, Booth asked one of the soldiers to hold up his hand so he could see them. The soldiers obliged, and while looking over his hand, Booth spoke his final words: "Useless, useless." Then at 7:15 a.m., John Wilkes Booth shuffled off this mortal coil. Who is more despised than John Wilkes Booth? What three named assassin makes your list? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.